confronts the people, the time that they are now going into the promised land, and having to subdue certain enemies and do the variety of things that they have to do. At the end of his life's journey, he's reminding them once again that they have to continue to make choices. That every day they have to choose to be faithful. Because he makes it very plain that how God is a jealous God and he is a demanding God, and you would think that after the 40 years experience of journeying from Egypt to the Promised Land, that they would have kind of gathered that meaning by now, that understanding, that God was certainly their God. He had chosen them, he loved them, he cared for them, he was delivering them, but he expected certain things from them. And if they weren't willing to give what God wanted from them, then they were going to find themselves in a terrible way. Not necessarily because God was going to do things to them, but as we see played out in the centuries of their history, the more they became unfaithful, slipping back into these patterns of doing whatever they wanted to do instead of what God called them to do and told them to do, they were usually then the prey of all kinds of other nations, and eventually they experience 2 major exiles. Of course, they have no awareness of any of that at this point. But the prophet, the leader, Joshua, is telling them in no uncertain terms, you have to know what you're doing, and you have to make this choice critically and seriously, and decide if you're going to, stay with it or not. Because you know how demanding God can be. So don't play games, in other words. Be serious about this. And of course, they say, oh, no, we're going to do this. We're going to be faithful. And it doesn't take very long for that protestation to be forgotten. And they slip back into patterns that they've had before. Every time something happens, though, God comes through. And God sends them judges, and later God gives them kings. And God makes all kinds of promises, and it goes back and forth this way forever. Which is probably a good thing for you and me, because that's, I think, how our lives with God tend to go. We go back and forth. There's sometimes we may be very fervent, and sometimes we may not be so fervent. Sometimes we might really be conscientiously trying to live a more exemplary Christian life in our attitudes and the things we say, and even maybe extending ourselves a little bit to try to share our faith with somebody else. And then there are other times that we don't want to try that at all, or we pull back, or we, kind of sit back nursing our doubts and our fears. Maybe this isn't all it's cracked up to be. Maybe the people who have walked away from faith or walked away from the church are the people who really understand what life is about. Maybe they're right, that we're, weak, that we need this spiritual crutch, because that atmosphere is growing among us, growing in this culture, making a lot of people who formerly were churched people to examine again what it is that this faith is supposed to be about. And I think that for you and me, the best thing, not necessarily the easiest, but the best thing to do is every day, as soon as our feet hit the floor, that we should give thanks that we have come to this new day. Now, a lot of us understand that when we come to the new day, that there are lots of things that may be waiting for us. Demands, problems that were there before, are carried over, difficulties that we may know are coming our way. We may also know that there are some great things that are awaiting us. But in everything, when we come to the beginning of a day, if we can just say thanks to God at the beginning of that day for the gift of it, we've already started off on the right foot. And then, as we progress through our beginning of the day, to ask the Lord for the grace to choose for that day, to follow Him faithfully in every way that He calls us to. Now that might sound like kind of going over the top, but I think it's the way that we train ourselves, we discipline ourselves to understand that we, first and foremost, before anything else, in our humanity, are servants of God, are brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ. We're children of God. We need the grace of God, the strength of God, to be able to live out that vocation, that call, that live up to that identity in the things that we do during the day. Because all of us understand how difficult it can be to stay focused, how difficult it can be to not slip into patterns of behavior, either of being critical or even being foul-mouthed about certain things, or to just kind of slip into a way of thinking or acting when we're with certain people that makes it kind of, difficult to discern whether we're really Christians or not. That we make a choice. And we make the choice daily because God gives us the grace and the gift of each day. You know, in the recovery movements, they talk about one day at a time. And sometimes it has to be one moment at a time, a minute at a time, an hour at a time. I think it's the same way in our spiritual life. It has to be one day at a time. I don't need to think about 50 years from now, or 20 years, or 10 years, or 2 years from now about how I'm going to be living my faith. I need to be concerned about how I'm going to live it today. How am I going to be faithful to Jesus today? How am I going to return good for some evil that might be done to me? How am I not going to respond in kind if someone flips me off or cusses me out? Like the other day when I was, driving, and this guy, I could read his lips because he came kind of shooting across my path, the pedestrian that I was supposed to stop for, and I was slowing down, and he comes out into the street anyway, and I probably would have gotten a ticket, but this guy looks at me, and I could read his lips, and it wasn't complimentary. And I think that my face even flushed red, that I was that embarrassed, but nevertheless, I could have rolled the window down and greeted him as well. But at least I restrained myself. But it's just that idea that, we have our patterns. But in order for us, I think, to become more Christ-like, requires this discipline of choosing each day to live this day, this hour, this moment as a disciple. What would the Lord have me do in this situation? It may sound trite, and it may be that way. I don't know. All I know is that if I try to program my life too far ahead, that I'm going to do all of these things, I will end up doing virtually none of them, or none of them at all, because I'm trying too much, trying to take on too much, to do too much. So I've learned over the years that the narrower focus, the focus on today, that discipline, and asking for the grace to live that way is usually better and is a better way for me. And I'm just suggesting that it might be a better way for you. That you make the choice every day. You know, in marriage preparation classes, one of the things I heard many, many years ago that has never left me is this idea too, that every day, when you start the day, you choose again to love this person that you have committed your life to and who has committed his or her life to you. That you make that choice every day to ask for the grace and the strength to do and to be and to love and to give to that person for that day. Because there are challenges that come our way every day. Some days we may not feel very loving. Some days we may not feel very forgiving. Some days it might be very difficult. And that's when we need that grace and that choice and decision so that we're not just blown around by our emotions, but that we stay rooted on the sure foundation, which is what Joshua was calling his people to do. To stand firm on the Lord and his grace, to choose to follow him and to choose that each day so they could successfully live in that land and become what God intended them to be. And I think that's the invitation to you and me as well. And that will show our wisdom. That will show that we are prepared to meet the Lord when he calls us. When he, as St. Paul talks about in the second lesson today. And even with a certain look at the gospel today, that would be the ones, that we would be the ones prepared when the bridegroom comes. That we're the ones that are ready because we've been trying to live daily the kind of faith that gives us the eyes to see and the heart to receive what the Lord wants us to have and how he wants us to live. So when he calls us, we will know who it is and why he is calling us to himself. This Eucharist this morning is our weekly encounter, reminder of Christ with us as he comes to us in his word and in his sacrament and through the presence of each other who believe, so that we can know that the one who calls us is true, the one who calls us loves us, and will continue to strengthen us to walk faithfully with him.